Do you remember the first time you ever felt a real connection to something on screen? Whether it was through a character, the entire show, a specific scene, or maybe just a single line? Was it because there was something similar to your own life? Perhaps something that resonated with your circumstances? I remember vividly when my lifelong friends had passed away in high school, some people who had become a significant piece of myself. It was the first time in my life that I really had to grieve. There were so many emotions whirling around, it was overwhelming, and I didn't know how to process it all. It was then that I remember watching a show called K-On! And seeing the way these five friends became closer and supported each other and functioned together as a happy whole, it hit me with how much of an uncanny reflection the show was of my life with my friends. All these emotions that for the longest time I didn't know how to deal with started pouring out. That was the moment, and that was the time when I felt a connection with the people behind the screen. I wasn't just watching someone else's story unfold, I was living it. I lived it, and I wanted to live it. It was then that I realized that anime, and the broader cinematographic medium, isn't something that can just entertain me, but that can resonate with me on some unspoken level that oftentimes reality cannot. This marked the beginning of my many years long journey through the anime genre, allowing myself to learn more about myself through stories and characters that ultimately embodied my own story and my own character. Koe no Katachi, hereon referred to as a silent voice, was the culmination and climax of this journey. The film tackles very difficult issues such as bullying, depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety, physical disability. However, it was special because it didn't overplay or portray these issues as anything dark or tragic, and approaches them all in a very grounded and realistic fashion. These issues were portrayed as something real and tangible, which they are. The protagonist, Shoya, undergoes significant growth and development over the course of the film. He struggled and then struggled some more, but was able to demolish the boundaries that he built around himself. Shoya, to me, perfectly embodies the emotional difficulties I struggled with for years, some of which I weren't even aware of. More than a catharsis, watching this boy felt like watching myself finally be able to overcome everything. So, what is it about this boy or about this girl in the show that so deeply embodies my own experiences? A large part of it boils down to their disabilities and how they manage them. A silent voice portrays Shoya and Shoko as burdened with their own disabilities, with one being unable to hear and the other being unable to connect. But really, how these disabilities are depicted in the film, how they are made so real and relatable, aren't how they function as plot devices, but instead as how they're presented as organic and personable characteristics of the characters we love so much. We see how their disabilities are humanized, how they affect our characters' relationships and their interactions and how they communicate, and also their self-worth. Shoko's deafness affected her socially in a straightforward way. Even when we're first introduced to her, she's already using paper and pencil to communicate. Despite the lengths she and the class would go to, Shoko is invariably still isolated from everyone else. Even her own family finds it difficult to connect with Shoko. Her mother blames herself for Shoko's circumstances and how much she has to suffer, and her sister, while protective, still often misunderstands Shoko. As a result, Shoko feels alone, with no one she can hear and no one to hear her. We also see Shoko struggle romantically, unable to express her emotions to the boy she likes, further complicated by their past together. However, Shoko is an incredibly human representation of how many people experience disability in our own reality. Disabilities such as deafness contribute greatly to the lack of agency and isolation that people with disabilities often feel. As stated by Michael Berube in his article Representation, disabilities and those who live with them are frequently spoken for and against by those without disabilities. We humans can hardly relate to someone who we cannot feasibly palpate what struggles they have, meaning that those humans that do suffer from a disability are largely thrust into a void of nothing but their own regard. Suicidal ideation, for this reason, in the disabled community is much higher than a non-disabled community, almost 3 times as high. Yet, despite these challenges, Shoko shows us that a human with a disability is still a human. She shows us that it is incredibly feasible to be resilient, headstrong, and not let her disability own her. Despite her lack of words, Shoko grew enough that it even seemed like she was communicating more than someone who can speak. Shoko, as much as she is a depiction of the struggles of disability, is also a portrayal of the resilience against these struggles. She, and to a great extent the entire film, is an important reminder about actively working against ableist assumptions. Shoko is still just a high school girl with high school desires and a high school personality in the end. And other people with disabilities or who experience disabilities in the end are also just still people. While not deaf or physically disabled, Shoyo is trapped and crippled in his own mind. He's held back by the guilt and shame of how he bullied Shoko in the past, and after being bullied himself, he is isolated in a cage away from the rest of the world. He struggles to express his emotions and communicate with others, resulting in a vicious cycle of further isolation. Mental and emotional health are irrevocably important. Severe detriments in mental health can result in the same sort of lack of agency and isolation that many people living with disabilities experience. Watching Shoya struggle with his circumstances, as well as watching him interact with Shoko and move forwards towards redeeming himself, I was him. I love this film, I really do, and I think there are a plethora of moments that exemplify how Shoko and Shoya's disabilities play into their communication, but also into their own growth. However, one scene in particular always comes to mind when I think about how the pair really incorporate everything they've experienced into their interactions.
あ、しまった。くそー、哀れた。
やったな、石田君。おい少年、貴様覗き見してるだろ。俺にも見せろ。ん？石田君、なんか手をひらひらやってる。
手話じゃねえの。
なんだって。すごいな。石田君にはそんな特技が。お前手話わかるのか。通訳しろ。
さっきのうんこ頭誰？全然知らない人。キモーい。
まじめに
話せよ。
落ちるなよ、少年。
本当はあってはいけないと思った。友達の意味をこの2週間ずっと考えていた。僕が君に会う理由探していた。
石田君。
嬉しい。私も同じこと考えてた。おかしいね。
あ、西宮、これパン恋に。餌やり楽しい。あ、そっか。西宮、やっぱそれあんまし見ない方が。待って、西宮！
落ちた。どうした？石田君がどうかしたのか？おい少年！石田君の川になんで？一体何するんだ？何これ？
西宮。
西宮！
ごめんな、落としちゃって。あ、うん。
This scene begins with some very intentional framing, quite literally using the frames of the camera as a device. The shot, done from a very high angled point of view, emphasizes the distance between the pair on the bridge and their supposed loved ones on the balcony. The use of asynchronous sounds and voicing ironically makes the audience experience somewhat of the deafness that Shoko does. We are then transported to where Shoya and Shoko are on the bridge, and are greeted with a few long-range shots that leave lots of empty space in all directions around our pair, further highlighting their isolation, but also their togetherness with each other. The most interesting part of this scene is that Shoya is depicted at the very left of the shot, even though the person he is with is even further left off-screen, and vice versa for Shoko. There's a massive amount of empty space on one side of the scene, and the framing here is quite uncomfortable and unsettling for the viewers on a fundamental level, demonstrating the anxiety and discomfort within the characters themselves. These shots appear multiple times throughout the film, specifically when Shoya is confronted by social interaction. For example, here when Shoya is hanging out with Nagatsuka, someone who proclaims Shoya to be his one and only friend, we see similar framing with his uncomfortable empty space. Shoya, who hasn't had a friend in years, is clearly unsure what to do and if they are even friends. The framing in these shots are amazing depictions of the social anxiety that are subtle enough not to distract from the core of the scene. Another powerful framing device within this scene is none other than the trees themselves. These pink blooms are called cherry blossoms, or sakura. In Japanese culture, cherry blossoms are an important symbol, embodying a slight melancholy at the impermanence or transience of all things. The framing here is a close reminder of the shaky nature of the relationship between Shoya and Shoko. Similar to how cherry petals fall to the ground, are whisked away by the wind, and inevitably perish somewhere, the past guilt that Shoya carries needs to perish to empower the relationship between the two in the future. The film makes it abundantly clear that there is no good or bad or pure or evil person, just a bunch of flawed teenagers struggling to communicate and relate with each other, regardless of whether or not they were born with hearing or without hearing. Relationships, interactions, communication, it's all transient, just like the petals on the wind. Lastly, the dive. As Shoko and Shoya breach the surface of the water, we're transported and transformed to a brand new, very blue environment. We're given close-ups of Shoko's feet and of Shoya's entire person as they dip into the river. This part of the scene sort of symbolizes the new territory that the pair are breaching into, working past their literal past and coming to a new understanding of each other, no matter how scary it may be. We see that Shoko didn't hesitate to jump in, but also didn't fully submerge herself, perhaps not yet willing to fully forget the past. Meanwhile, Shoya is ready to move on, but when reminded of Shoko's presence, comes back to reality. Overall, this entire scene is one of the most meaningful in the film. The reorientation of sound and conversation is striking, as we see that Shoya is actually the only one speaking, with Shoko barely even signing in return. The wild array of various framings serves wonderfully to emphasize how uncomfortable this new territory the pair are wandering into really is, and we, as an audience, are equally unnerved by the strange techniques used to frame. The presence of the cherry blossoms, more than just beautifying the scene, reminds us of whatever relationships and interactions were in the past. To work and grow from them, we need to perish them and move on. Shoya, Shoko, the entirety of Koe no Katachi is a perfect embodiment of the turmoil the average teenager goes through. The film tackles bullying, depression, social and emotional isolation, and it does all that through extremely relatable and human characters. We see Shoya's life, we see Shoko's life, and through their lived experiences, we are able to challenge the ableist gaze and understand each person as they really are, a fellow person. To sum up the points I'm trying to make, we all go through a strange love-hate relationship with life, and many of us do find ourselves in a weird, isolated place sometimes. But this film, anime as a whole, has provided me with so many opportunities to meet new people, form real connections, and also gave me the courage to forgive myself for my own past and move on. It really is quite amazing, and for others who are embarking on their own journey, I wish you the very best.